If you're drawn to cases where the smallest detail hides the greatest truth, make sure to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. This is the criminal Schema, and tonight, we revisit a case buried beneath decades of silence, fear, and unanswered questions. Her bicycle was still lying on its side when they found it, one wheel slowly turning under the pale glow of a street lamp. It was a chilly November evening in the year 1957, and the tiny Illinois town of Silver Creek slept under a curtain of fog. The handlebars pointed toward the darkness, like a silent question waiting for someone brave enough to answer it. The front gate of the Miller home stood open, creaking in the wind. But 5-year-old Susie Miller was gone. What happened in Silver Creek that night would cling to the town for generations. A tale of innocence, stolen in an era when such things were believed to happen only far away, in cities filled with strangers, not in a tight-knit farming community where everyone knew everyone else's name, and where children rode bicycles freely between neighbors' houses. Saturday, November 16, 1957 began like any other late autumn afternoon in Silver Creek. The harvest was over. Families finally had time to breathe, and, as they did every year, they gathered at the Carson family farm to celebrate the end of the season. The tradition was simple, a daytime picnic that drifted into evening, with homemade pies on the tables, steam rising from mugs of cider, and children chasing each other between rows of dry corn stalks. Little Susie arrived with her parents, John and Patricia Miller, shortly after 3 in the afternoon. She wore a red cardigan over her favorite checkered dress, her blonde hair tied back with a blue ribbon. 5 years old, full of imagination, known for hopping down sidewalks and humming church songs under her breath. Everyone in Silver Creek knew Susie. As dusk settled around 5:30 in the evening, the adults moved indoors to the farmhouse kitchen for more dessert and coffee. The children stayed outside, watched loosely by a couple of teenagers helping the Carsons with the gathering. Susie was last seen near the barn, trailing after the Carson family cat with another little girl. When that child's mother called her inside, Susie turned back toward the farmhouse alone. For a moment, her small frame was visible in the lantern glow, and then she vanished into the deepening shadows. By 6 o'clock, Patricia noticed her daughter was missing. At first she didn't panic. This was Silver Creek, after all. A child could wander into any room or any neighbor's arms. But when Susie wasn't inside, and wasn't outside, and wasn't with any of the other children, something cold settled in Patricia's chest. The only clue they found was Susie's doll, Lucy, lying in the grass near the porch. John Miller gathered several men and began searching with flashlights. They called out her name, expecting to find her hiding behind a hay bale or perhaps giggling from inside a chicken coop. But with every minute that passed, the calls grew sharper, the beams of light more frantic. A child did not simply disappear in Silver Creek. By 6:45, John raced into town to alert the authorities. Deputy William Evans responded first. He followed John back to the farm, red emergency lights slicing through the fog. Sheriff Roy Parker arrived shortly afterward. Near the bend in the dirt road leading back toward town, they found Susie's small blue bicycle abandoned on the gravel shoulder. It lay tipped over, as though dropped in a hurry, one training wheel caught in a rut. Evans's flashlight then revealed a second clue. One of Susie's black patent leather shoes in the weeds by the drainage ditch. The shoelace was still tied neatly. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just an overturned bicycle, a shoe, and darkness. The deputies formed a line and swept the area. They searched the road, the ditches, the barns, the creeks. Their shouts echoed through the fog. Susie, but there was no reply. By 9 that night, half the town had arrived to help. Neighbors brought lanterns, some carried rifles to ward off stray dogs. Women huddled around Patricia, trying to keep her calm. Men trudged through the fields, calling into the night until their voices cracked. At midnight, Sheriff Parker reluctantly pulled back the search. Volunteers were told to rest and return by dawn. No one wanted to go home. No one wanted to leave the Millers there alone with the silence. That silence grew heavier with the sunrise. Sunday brought more searchers, over 100 by 8 that morning. State police dogs arrived from Springfield. Given Susie's cardigan to smell, they followed her trail down the dirt road, past the abandoned bicycle. Then, barely 30 feet beyond that point, the scent vanished. The handler looked at Sheriff Parker with dread. It's like she just disappeared. Someone might have picked her up. No one wanted to say the word kidnapping, but they all felt it. Searchers scoured the woods, the fields, the farms. They checked wells, barns, drainage pipes, every place a small child could hide or be hidden. Nothing. By nightfall on Sunday, hope had thinned to the width of a single thread. Sheriff Parker addressed the weary townspeople gathered at the fire station, thanking them for their help and urging them to stay strong. Inside, Patricia and John sat beneath Susie's school photo, her gap-toothed grin printed above the word, "missing." Patricia broke down when she saw it. John stayed beside her, though his own face was ghost-like with fear. On Monday, as the investigation began, whispers filled grocery aisles and church steps. Silver Creek was a place where neighbors trusted one another with unlocked doors and unguarded hearts. A vanishing like this was unthinkable. Parker and Deputy Evans began interviewing everyone who had been at the Carson farm. Most saw Susie at some point, but nothing unusual, nothing alarming, no screaming, no strangers. Yet a few uncertain glimpses floated to the surface. An elderly farmhand claimed he saw a man walking with a little girl in a plaid dress around 6 that evening on County Route 6. A woman driving home said she saw a blue bicycle in the back of a pickup truck later that night. And Susie's teenage cousin remembered Susie near the farm gate at about 5:45, talking to an adult she thought she recognized. Each clue was intriguing, yet none were solid. Throughout the week, leads poured in. Every one of them fizzled. Reporters arrived. Headlines spread across Illinois. John Miller faced the cameras and pleaded for his daughter to come home. With increasing pressure, Sheriff Parker pursued theories involving traveling workers or strangers passing through. He interrogated a drifter named James Costa, but nothing tied him to the crime. Eventually, that lead, like the others, faded. By early December, the stranger theory weakened. Rumors whispered that maybe the danger wasn't from outside Silver Creek, but from within. Still, there was no evidence, and soon snow erased whatever tracks might have remained. By the following spring, Susie's case had gone cold. But in the woods near Silver Creek, the truth was waiting. Waiting for thaw. Waiting for discovery. Waiting for the day when it would finally force its way to the surface. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps us keep digging into cold cases like this one. In the spring of 1962, more than 4 years after Susie Miller vanished, a farmer clearing a small patch of woodland at the edge of Silver Creek found something no one expected to see again: a child's skull and a jawbone barely 2 feet beneath the soil. The discovery cut through the town like a winter gust. Sheriff Roy Parker and the county coroner rushed to the scene, the weight of that discovery settling onto shoulders that had already carried so much worry. The bones were scattered and weathered, moved in places by time and animal activity. They were unmistakably the remains of a very young child. The sheriff sent them to the state laboratory in Springfield for analysis. For the people of Silver Creek, there was a single, prayerful hope: that the bones might not belong to Susie. For the Millers, the pain was immediate and absolute. When lab results came back in mid-May, the medical examiner reported the remains were those of a female child about 5 to 7 years old, likely buried in the same era as Susie's disappearance. There were no obvious traumatic injuries on the bones. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty because of decomposition, but the teeth told a clearer story. 2 small dental fillings matched the type of work Susie had received shortly before she disappeared. In the era's limited forensic language, the report stopped short of saying it was definitively Susie. Yet the implication was unmistakable. For John and Patricia Miller, there was no doubt. For them, the remains were their daughter. A small funeral was held in June of 1962. The town filled the little church, and a child's casket was lowered into the earth. A headstone went up in the Silver Creek Cemetery with her name and the years of her short life. The community gathered, not because the answer comforted anyone so much as to mark the end of a long uncertainty. Officials reclassified the case as a homicide, but with no suspect and no clear cause of death, the file began to cool again. Sheriff Parker kept the case open as long as he could. He revisited the map of the roads and the notes from the original interviews. But with each passing month, the trail grew faint. By the time Parker retired a few years later, the document box containing Susie's file sat in a storage room, battered by time and neglect, waiting for someone to reopen it. In Silver Creek, life tried to find a rhythm again. But something had changed. Parents watched their children with new intensity. The school desk that should have held Susie's small body sat empty for years, a quiet reminder at the back of the room. The Millers kept their daughter's room exactly as it had been the day she disappeared. Dolls in place, a teddy bear on the pillow, an attempt to hold on to what had been taken. Rumors persisted. People whispered about strange cars on back roads, or men who were seen near the Carson farm on the wrong night. One piece of gossip, however, stood out because it involved a member of the community who had left town under strange circumstances. In the winter following Susie's disappearance, the owner of Whitaker's Hardware, a respected man named James Whitaker, closed his business and moved away. He said he left to help family in Springfield. It was abrupt, and the town noticed. Whitaker had been an active member of the community, a deacon at church, a coach for the Little League, someone who had helped neighbors more than once. Still, in a town that prized privacy and reputation, suspicion is slow to take hold. Few connected Whitaker's sudden departure to Susie's disappearance, at least, not openly. Over the following years, the case faded from the regional headlines. The sheriff's office received fewer calls. New crimes and tragedies demanded attention. The file on Susie gathered dust, but the memory remained. The Millers aged, always carrying their grief. John died some years later, and Patricia faded into the quiet persistence of a life shaped around that absence. She kept an album of clippings and never stopped looking for patterns among missing children across the country, hoping for a thread that might lead back to her daughter. Then the decades moved forward. Advances in forensic science, especially in the field of genetic identification, would eventually change the way cold cases were approached. But the groundwork of this case was laid years earlier, in the small acts and the overlooked evidence that, once re-examined with fresh eyes and new techniques, would make the difference. For now, however, Silver Creek learned to live with the unresolved ache of the 1950s. The town reluctantly accepted that some questions could remain open for years, and that some answers, if they ever came, would arrive long after the people who most needed them were gone. As the case cooled, the record showed only what had been found and what had been asked. A bicycle on the roadside, a single patent shoe in the weeds, a scent trail that stopped as if at the edge of the world. Those were the facts that lived in the sheriff's file and in the minds of the people who had searched the fields and the woods that autumn night. But one other item would patiently wait in the file box for decades. A small, folded envelope labeled with a date in 1958 and marked in faded pencil. It contained a letter that would sit unread and unanswered until someone decades later decided to look again. If you want to hear how that overlooked note reignited the investigation and changed everything, make sure you like this video and subscribe to The Criminal Schema. If you're finding this investigation compelling, don't forget to like the video, drop a comment, and subscribe to The Criminal Schema so more people can join us as we uncover truths long buried by time. For decades, the file containing the story of Susie Miller sat quietly in the sheriff's storage room, its edges frayed, its papers yellowed, its unanswered questions gathering dust like a forgotten winter coat. In Silver Creek, the world had moved on in small but persistent ways. The farmland changed hands, businesses closed and reopened, and children who once searched for Susie grew into parents and then grandparents. Yet the memory of that November night in the late 1950s never fully faded. It lived on like a faint echo, soft, steady, and unresolved. By the early years of the 21st century, the case had aged more than half a lifetime, and with each passing year, the uncertainty of what happened to Susie seemed destined to drift further into the realm of old local legends. Stories whispered to newcomers, cautionary tales told to children who played near the woods, or memories discussed quietly after church services by those old enough to remember the fear that once crept through their small rural town. But in the year 2008, more than 50 years after Susie's disappearance, someone decided the story was not done yet. Retired Illinois State Police Detective Arthur Lewis had never let go of the case. Even after leaving active duty, the disappearance of Susie Miller lingered in his mind like a loose thread. Lewis was a methodical investigator, known for patience, persistence, and a belief that cold cases were never truly closed. They simply awaited the right person with the right tools at the right time. In his retirement, Lewis spent several afternoons revisiting old investigative files from the 1950s and 1960s. It was part personal interest, part professional discipline, and no case tugged at him more than that of little Susie. He remembered seeing her faded school photograph at a training facility decades earlier, a reminder of how easily a life could slip from the world without answers. When DNA technology advanced dramatically in the early 2000s, Lewis grew increasingly convinced that the remains found in 1962 could finally be identified with certainty. He pitched the idea to Sheriff Dan Coleman of Macoupin County, who was open to cold case reviews under a state initiative that offered funding for forensic re-examination. The remains labeled Jane Doe, probable Susie Miller, were transported to a modern lab where technicians performed tests impossible in the era of Susie's disappearance. Though the bones were fragile and compromised by time, a usable genetic profile was eventually extracted. A maternal relative of Susie provided a comparison sample. In September of the year 2008, the results arrived. The bones discovered in Silver Creek Woods nearly 5 decades earlier were confirmed with more than 99% certainty to belong to Susie Miller. The identification jolted the town and reignited the investigation that had long been overshadowed by the passing of time. For the first time in decades, the case was no longer stalled in place. It had been given new life, a new direction, and renewed public interest. Sheriff Coleman held a press conference where he officially declared Susie's case to be a homicide, promising it would be pursued with the full weight of modern investigative methods. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes, and many residents of Silver Creek found themselves reliving emotions they had buried long ago. Some remembered being children when Susie vanished. Others had been part of the original search and were now elderly, their memories softened but still vivid in the spaces where trauma refuses to fade. Detective Lewis set up a workspace dedicated solely to Susie's file. He spread decades-old documents across a long conference table, photographs, interviews, notes, maps, evidence logs, all of it carefully sorted. The room became a kind of time capsule, each piece a reminder of the huge effort that had once swept through Silver Creek as neighbors searched desperately for a child who would not be found alive. Lewis dug deep into the file. He read and reread every page, sometimes late into the night. He traced the old timeline, trying to understand the gaps and inconsistencies that plagued the original investigation. He studied the witness statements, every description of where Susie had been seen, who was present, what vehicles were in the area, and what sounds people remembered or didn't remember. One detail kept him awake: how quickly the scent trail had vanished on the road near the bicycle. It had always suggested a vehicle. It had always implied that someone had taken Susie in a moment of vulnerability. Yet no outsider had ever been credibly connected to the case. As Lewis examined the pages, he began to suspect that the truth might have been present in the file all along, perhaps hidden not by intent but by the overwhelming chaos of the original search and the limitations of mid-century detective work. It was nearly midnight on an early autumn evening when he opened a box filled with documents that had not been revisited in decades. Inside, sealed in an old manila envelope, he found a letter dated in December of 1958, labeled simply, "Anonymous Tip." The envelope had never been opened. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but remained legible enough for Lewis to read. The letter claimed that on the night of Susie's disappearance, someone had seen her near the Old Hill Creek Bridge, accompanied by a man she appeared to know. The anonymous writer described raised voices, a child who seemed upset, and an adult who lifted her into his arms. The letter claimed the man was someone well known in town, a trusted individual, not a stranger. The writer said they feared retaliation if they revealed his name outright, but cryptically added, "Ask yourself, who left town suddenly?" Shortly after that night, Lewis felt the room shift. Everything in the letter hinted toward a line of inquiry that had never been explored fully. Silver Creek had always assumed that the only possible danger came from outside the community. But this letter suggested something else entirely. The possibility that someone from within the town had been responsible, someone respected, someone trusted, someone who had left abruptly. Immediately, Lewis thought of James Whitaker, the hardware store owner who had moved away a few months after Susie disappeared. Whitaker had always been considered a model citizen. He had volunteered in the original search. He had helped families. He had been seen as a reliable member of Silver Creek. And yet, his sudden departure in early 1958, explained away by family obligations, now seemed far more curious. Lewis began making calls. He tracked down former neighbors, former employees, and anyone who might remember Whitaker's behavior during the months surrounding Susie's disappearance. One former store clerk, now in his late 70s, recalled Whitaker acting strangely in the winter of 1957. He had been nervous, losing weight, and once admitted to the clerk that he had made a mistake he could not undo. At the time, the clerk assumed it was about finances or a personal issue, but now that vague confession seemed far more ominous. Lewis reviewed the notes again and discovered that Whitaker and his family had indeed attended the Carson farm picnic the very afternoon Susie vanished. They reportedly left early around 5 o'clock because one of their children felt unwell. That timeline placed Whitaker on the road near the farm at the exact window when Susie disappeared. Piece by piece, the image began to sharpen. Lewis felt he had stumbled on the first real breakthrough since the remains had been found. He coordinated with Sheriff Coleman and officers in Springfield, where Whitaker was living in a retirement facility. If Whitaker was involved, time was running out. He was in his mid-80s, and his health was deteriorating. The meeting was arranged for March of 2009. Lewis prepared carefully. He reread the anonymous letter multiple times, studied the newly gathered testimonies, rehearsed the questions, and steeled himself for a difficult conversation with an elderly man who might have been hiding a terrible truth for more than half a century. When Lewis and Sheriff Coleman visited the retirement home, they found Whitaker frail, his hands trembling, but his mind sharp enough to understand why they were there. At first, Whitaker repeated the same story he had told for 50 years. He left Silver Creek to care for his sick mother, and he had nothing to do with Susie's disappearance. But when Lewis gently presented the anonymous letter, the timeline, the testimonies, and the inconsistencies, Whitaker's composure cracked. His hands shook harder. Tears filled his eyes. And then, weakened by age, memory, and guilt, he began to speak. The confession that followed would finally reveal the truth Silver Creek had been yearning to know for more than 5 decades. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Criminal Schema for Part 4, where we uncover the full confession that brought the truth into the light after so many years. James Whitaker sat across from Detective Arthur Lewis and Sheriff Dan Coleman in a quiet room of the Springfield retirement facility, the hum of medical equipment steady in the background. He was 84 years old, thin from age and illness, but his eyes, tired though they were, still held a sharpness that suggested the story he'd kept hidden was ready to surface. For the first several minutes of the interview, Whitaker repeated the same narrative he had told neighbors, friends, and investigators decades earlier. He had left Silver Creek in early 1958 to care for his ailing mother in Springfield. He had no knowledge about what happened to Susie Miller. He had helped in the search like everyone else. He was simply a family man trying to do right by the community. But Detective Lewis gently unfolded the faded anonymous letter from December of 1958. He placed it on the table between them. Lewis then explained how the letter described a man seen with Susie at the old Hill Creek Bridge on the night she vanished. A man she appeared to know. A man whose identity the writer refused to reveal for fear of retaliation. The final line pointed to someone who had left town abruptly. Whitaker stared at the paper, his jaw trembling. He swallowed hard, trying to hold on to the story he'd kept for more than 50 years. Sheriff Coleman spoke softly, telling him that the truth mattered not just for justice, but for the town, for the memory of a child, and for the countless people who had lived with a question that demanded an answer. Whitaker's hands shook violently, Parkinson's disease, or guilt, or both, and then, without warning, the dam broke. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "I have lived with this for over half a century." The room fell silent. Even the machines seemed to quiet themselves as the weight of the confession settled. He explained that he had developed an unhealthy fixation on little Susie, a fixation he said he never acted upon until that night. Susie knew him as Mr. Whitaker, the friendly man from church whose daughter attended Sunday school with her. Because of that familiarity, she trusted him. On November 16, 1957, after leaving the Carson farm with his family earlier in the evening, Whitaker waited until his wife was distracted, settling their children at home. Then he told her he had forgotten a jacket at the picnic and needed to return. That part of the story was a lie. He drove back toward the farm with a darker purpose brewing beneath the surface of his outwardly calm demeanor. When he arrived, searchers had not yet begun looking for Susie. She was simply outside somewhere, playing as children did. Whitaker found her near the front gate, standing by the roadside. She wasn't crying or scared. She greeted him in the innocent way only a child could. Whitaker said he told her her parents had asked him to walk her home. She believed him. As they walked down the dimly lit lane toward the old Hill Creek Bridge, Susie began to sense something was wrong. She asked for her mother. She cried. Her small voice carried through the cold night, and Whitaker, panicking, worried someone might hear her fear. He described the moment in a broken, halting voice. Susie trying to pull away, her cries growing louder. In a desperation only he fully understood, he placed his hand over her mouth, shushing her with a trembling whisper. He insisted he had not meant to cause fatal harm. But as he pressed harder in his attempt to silence her, her struggles weakened. Then they stopped. Whitaker said he froze, staring at the little girl in his arms. He waited for her to move, to breathe, to open her eyes, but she did none of those things. After several minutes of disbelief, he realized she was gone. His voice cracked as he told the detectives, "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just didn't want her screaming. I didn't know what to do." He carried her to his car, hidden on a small pull-off near the woods. He placed her gently in the back seat, then drove deeper into Silver Creek Woods, under cover of darkness. There, he dug a shallow grave using only his hands and a small garden trowel he kept in the trunk. He buried Susie beneath a thin layer of earth and leaves. He added more branches to hide the disturbed soil. Then, in a bid to mislead investigators, he placed her second shoe and a few personal items near the roadside ditch where the first clues had been found. When he returned home well after dark, he told his wife he had stopped to help a stranded motorist, offering an explanation for his delay. She believed him. Whitaker then joined the massive search effort the following day, calling her name alongside neighbors and friends, walking past areas he knew she would never be found alive. As Whitaker spoke, tears streamed down his cheeks. He described the crushing guilt that consumed him for years, the sleepless nights, the fear of being discovered, the dread whenever a new tip reached the sheriff's office. He told the detectives that his abrupt departure from Silver Creek had not been for family reasons, but because he feared an eventual accusation. Leaving felt like his only chance to escape the place where the truth could catch him at any moment. Detective Lewis then asked the question he had been waiting to ask. Did anyone else know? Whitaker hesitated, then answered, yes. He revealed that a week after the burial, unable to sleep and terrified the grave might be found, he confided in his trusted employee, Alan Barnes. Whitaker told Barnes he had done something terrible and needed help to better conceal the burial site. Barnes, stunned and unsure of what to believe, agreed to follow Whitaker into the woods. Together, the two men added more soil, branches, and brush to erase signs of the shallow grave. Barnes told no one. Whitaker told no one else. The detective took a long moment to absorb the gravity of what he had just heard. More than 50 years had passed since the night a small girl disappeared from a quiet Illinois town, taken not by a stranger but by someone she knew, someone the entire community trusted. Whitaker signed a written confession. He cried as he signed it. Even after 5 decades, the weight of the truth had not lessened. He was arrested at the retirement facility and charged with kidnapping and homicide. But before the legal system could move forward with a full trial, his failing health accelerated. He was transferred to a prison medical ward, where he spent his final days under guard. In July of 2009, James Whitaker died of pneumonia at the age of 84. In court filings, he stated, "I have been in a prison of my own mind for more than 50 years." After Whitaker's death, Alan Barnes, now 79, was interviewed. He confirmed the story, his voice filled with regret. He explained that he had been shocked by Whitaker's confession in the late 1950s, but had not known how to come forward. Fear kept him silent for more than half a lifetime. Given his age, failing health, and the extraordinary passage of time, he received a suspended sentence for assisting in concealing the crime. When news reached Silver Creek, the reaction was overwhelming, a swirling mix of anger, sorrow, and relief. For generations, residents had believed the danger had come from outside their community. The revelation that the truth had been hidden within their circle of trust shielded behind the friendly facade of an upstanding citizen, reframed everything they thought they knew about their town. The community organized a memorial service for Susie on the anniversary of her disappearance, 52 years to the day after she vanished. The church overflowed with people. Childhood friends of Susie attended now as adults with children and grandchildren of their own. Tears flowed freely as they honored the little girl who had been frozen in time at the age of 5. Photographs of Susie were displayed, her bright smile, her blue ribbon, the drawings she had made in Sunday school. Her innocence radiated from each image, unchanged by the years that had passed. The pastor delivered a moving message about truth, closure, and the resilience of a community. Detective Lewis spoke briefly, explaining how the case was revived and expressing his only regret, that Susie's parents had not lived to witness this moment of clarity. From the church, a procession moved to Silver Creek Cemetery. Workers had updated the engraving on Susie's headstone, adding the year of her DNA identification and the year the truth was revealed. Beneath those dates was etched a simple verse about truth bringing freedom. Among the crowd stood a frail, elderly Sheriff Roy Parker. He had carried the burden of this unsolved case his entire life. He approached Susie's grave, placed a trembling hand on the stone, and whispered words only he could hear, an apology, a farewell, perhaps a confession of his own regrets. The weight he had carried for more than half a century finally lifted, even if only slightly. He passed away the following year. The truth, after all that time, had finally surfaced. But the story, and the lessons it held, were far from finished. The confession of James Whitaker did more than solve a cold case. It shook an entire community to its core, forcing Silver Creek to reconcile with a truth it had resisted for more than half a century. That the danger had not drifted in from the highways or from passing strangers, but had lived quietly among them, waving from porches, ringing up hardware purchases, bowing his head with them in church pews. In the days following the confession's release to the public, Silver Creek felt as if it were reliving the late 1950s all over again. Newspaper reports revisited the story with a mix of shock and retrospective clarity. Radio stations replayed archival recordings of the pleas John Miller had made in 1957, his voice trembling with hope that his daughter might still be alive. For many who had known Susie personally, hearing those old recordings after so long stirred emotions buried deep. Elderly residents who remembered the search effort gathered on porches and in diners, sharing memories of the night they walked through the fog with lanterns and flashlights, calling out a little girl's name. Some recalled that Whitaker had been among them, shouting, "Susie," with the same intensity as everyone else. The betrayal felt intimate, profound, and unsettling. Many struggled with the realization that they had trusted him fully. A few recalled him helping repair fences or lending tools from his store, or showing up to community events with a polite smile and clean shirt. He had presented himself as a family man, a dependable neighbor, the sort of person parents in Silver Creek never would have suspected. The psychological impact was enormous. People questioned their own memories. They questioned their own judgments. For decades, they had believed Silver Creek to be safe, a small refuge from the world's greater dangers. Now, they found themselves wondering what signs they had missed, what moments they had overlooked, and how the man they had once admired had managed to hide something so terrible for so long. There was anger, anger at Whitaker, anger at his silence, and anger at the fact that justice had waited until long after Susie's parents had passed away. Many residents wished the truth had been uncovered earlier, when the Millers could have seen it. Patricia Miller, in particular, had chased answers until her final day, penning letters to officials, taping articles into a scrapbook, hoping for even the smallest breakthrough. But though she didn't live to see it, many believed she had something to do with the case reopening. The persistence she embodied lived on in the investigators who eventually returned to the file. Silver Creek residents spoke softly about that possibility in the weeks after the confession, suggesting that perhaps, just perhaps, the universe had finally chosen to honor her determination. In the months following the revelation, Silver Creek decided it needed something tangible, something rooted in the community, to make sense of such a long and painful chapter. A special town hall meeting was held at the fire station, where residents stood in line to share thoughts and memories. Some spoke of Susie's laughter and the innocence she had brought into every room. Others spoke of the fear that had swept the town like a bitter wind, and how the disappearance had changed the way they raised their children. A few spoke directly about Whitaker, trying to reconcile the man they had known with the truth he had spent his life hiding. At the meeting, the idea emerged to create a memorial space, not just the cemetery headstone, but something living, where children could play and where the townspeople could remember Susie in a way that celebrated her spirit rather than just the tragedy. The town had a small playground near the edge of the old schoolyard. It wasn't much, just a handful of swings, some metal slides, and a patch of grass where kids played tag. It had been there for decades and was due for repairs. The community decided to renovate the playground, update it, expand it, and dedicate it to Susie Miller. By the following summer, volunteers worked weekend after weekend, planting new trees, installing bright red and blue swings, adding benches and flower beds. Parents brought paintbrushes, teenagers hauled mulch, and even elderly residents showed up with lemonade and sandwiches. On the day the new sign was revealed, Susie Miller Memorial Playground, the entire town gathered. Children ran across the grass, their laughter ringing through the air, a sound that felt long overdue. Parents stood in small groups, watching with bittersweet smiles. Though the playground was a tribute to a life cut short, it also represented resilience, community, and the enduring hope that something good could emerge from so much pain. Near the entrance of the playground, a bronze plaque was installed. It told Susie's story gently, with care, focusing not on the details of her final moments, but on the spirit of the girl who had brought joy to those around her. It reminded families to hold their children close, to protect one another, and to never let fear erase the beauty of childhood. People read that plaque quietly, sometimes laying flowers at its base, sometimes touching the metal softly before walking away. Visitors from neighboring towns came to see it, and as word of the case revived through media reports, more people traveled to Silver Creek, curious about the place that had waited so long for justice. The case also sparked wider discussions about child safety, both within Silver Creek and in surrounding communities. Schools introduced new protocols. Parents became more involved in neighborhood watch programs. State officials used the case as an example of why cold cases must be preserved and periodically revisited. Even law enforcement academies studied the case to understand how investigative techniques had evolved and how critical it was to never dismiss a lead, no matter how small or how far removed in time. In the wake of the final revelations, Detective Arthur Lewis became a modest, almost reluctant figure of recognition. People praised his persistence, his careful review of old evidence, and his belief that no case was truly beyond hope. But Lewis himself insisted that he had simply done what needed to be done, what should have been done years earlier. He credited the anonymous letter writer for having the courage, however incomplete, to leave a clue. He credited the advancements in forensic science. And he credited the community, which had kept Susie's memory alive for half a century. When asked during a later interview what stayed with him most from the case, Lewis paused thoughtfully and said, "It reminded me that truth doesn't disappear. It waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, but it waits. And eventually, someone looks again." As Silver Creek slowly settled into its new normal, people continued to visit Susie's grave. Children who had once been her classmates were now grown, and many brought their own children or grandchildren to pay respects. They told stories about the little girl with the blue ribbon, the one who had loved hopscotch and humming simple songs. They spoke of the foggy night when the town searched every field they could think of, and how the absence of answers had haunted them for decades. But now, the story had an ending. A painful one, yes, but an ending that allowed the town to breathe again. In the fall, after the confession was made public, First Methodist Church hosted a special service dedicated not only to Susie, but to all missing children, those who had been found and those still lost. The pastor spoke about community, responsibility, and the sacred duty of protecting the innocent. Candles were lit for Susie and for countless others taken too soon. People often wondered about the anonymous letter writer from 1958. No one ever came forward, and some believed the writer had passed away long before the truth came to light. Others thought the writer may have been present at the memorial service, watching quietly as the town healed at last. Whoever it was, their decision to write that letter, though cryptic, had given law enforcement just enough direction to reopen a path that had once seemed permanently closed. The playground, the grave, the plaque, and the stories preserved Susie's memory for future generations. She was no longer just a face on a fading poster. She was a reminder of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the courage to seek truth even when decades have passed. In the end, the case of Susie Miller was not a tale of triumph, but a somber reminder of the fragility of innocence. It showed that justice can be delayed beyond reason, tangled in time, hidden by false assumptions and trusted faces. But it also proved that even after 50 years, truth has a way of resurfacing, sometimes quietly, sometimes unexpectedly, but always with purpose. Silver Creek carries that lesson now. Its residents still tell the story to their children, not with fear, but with reverence. They walk past the playground, past the plaque, past the cemetery where Susie rests beside her parents, and they remember. They remember the girl who disappeared on a foggy November evening. They remember the searchlights cutting through the darkness. They remember the unanswered questions that lingered for half a century. They remember the moment the truth came home at last. And they remember that peace, even after such a loss, can eventually be found. This is the Criminal Schema, and this concludes our 5-part documentary retelling of the Susie Miller case. If you found this story meaningful or important, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more deep investigations into cases where justice takes far too long to arrive. Thank you for watching.